Paris on traveling around, and he asked himself. He said, do I want to go back into business? Because I really don't. At its heart, a company's vision needs to be inspiring and uplifting. If your employees don't know what your vision is, you haven't done a good job of communicating it. This most people don't even understand that SWOT analysis means strengths and weaknesses are internal to the company, opportunities and threats are external to the company.
Welcome to Vibrant Publishers Podcast. Our guest today is Professor Vishal Gupta, a distinguished educator and researcher with over 100 peer reviewed publications in top journals like the Academy of Management Journal and the Journal of Applied Psychology, with extensive global teaching experience in the US, India, and Bahrain. He specializes in strategic management and entrepreneurship. Vishal, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Johannes, for having me.
Topic we'll be discussing today is strategic management. And when you think of strategic management, it sounds like a very complex concept. But at the core of it, it's about making smart decisions to help your business succeed. My first question to you would be, how do you explain strategic management to someone in simple terms?
Well, we can start with what you just said, right? Which is making smart decisions for the success of your business. And
Absolutely.
you are also correct that at its core, it seems like a very simple concept thing to understand. Who doesn't want to make smart decisions for their business or for their life, right? Um, but I think the challenge with strategic management is uh, in understanding its scope and in implementing strategic management in sort of your everyday decisions or your actual working in the business or your life. So, sort of, if I was to build on what you said, which is smart thinking for your smart decisions for your business, I would also say it's sort of about understanding the past, making sense of the past, anticipating the future, or making the future happen, all at the time that you are running the day to day of the business. So I think strategic management has these three components of sort of forward looking, backward looking, and yet sort of being immersed in the present. And I think, like most business concepts, uh, it's the implementation that proves challenging for many, many people.
Interesting. So we got to ensure we don't just look at our current situation, but learn from the past and absolutely like strategize for the future.
Yeah, you got to anticipate future trends, right? Um, People like to say, when I was in college, half of the technologies that exist now, we didn't even know it was possible for them to exist, right?
Correct.
I remind students that, iPhone came out only in 2008. Before 2003 or 4, nobody had thought something like YouTube was possible, where as I understand that this podcast will be made available, right? There was
Correct.
nothing like that. Most people are not good at anticipating these future trends, right? If you stand in a classroom like I do every semester and I ask students, what technologies do you think don't exist today but will exist 20 years from now when you'll be my age, right? That's a very challenging question for students to think about. And that is because most of us are not good at anticipating future trends. Yet when you're managing a company, you have to anticipate future trends. You have to think about what might happen 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. And many of the successful companies not just anticipate future trends, they also create or effectuate or produce those future trends, right? And so
Correct.
I think we we are talking about something that's not easy or doesn't come naturally for most people. Uh, And so you have to sort of work at it. Same thing with looking back and making sense of the past. We think all of us, intuitively must be good at making sense of the past, but we are not, because of a fundamental human attribution error, which is all the good things that happened to me or my organization must be a result of what I did. All the bad things that happened must have been a result of external forces or somebody else's fault. And
Yes.
so even looking back and making sense of the past is not does not come easy to most of us. And that's what a good strategic manager does. That's what good strategic management is. If it came naturally to us, then we would need a course in strategic management. We wouldn't have a lack or a dearth of good strategic thinkers.
Correct. I completely agree with that. And even the point that you said about anticipating future trends and how it is difficult, it truly is. We tend to uh, ignore how difficult it is. We tend to think it's quite easy to look forward into the future and make predictions. But as you mentioned, with the technology also evolving, a lot of the things that are there now available technology wise, I mean, you couldn't even predict it. It's
No.
so strange. If you just talk about AI, I get most of my tasks automated with the help of AI. You get insights for books. A lot of things can be done. It's absolutely unimaginable. If you were to go 10 years back and tell somebody like this is what the future would look like, it would completely blow their mind.
Mhm.
So it truly is a skill to look into the future, recognize trends, and to be able to implement things in the present that would be able to help you gain benefits in the future.
And when it comes to something like strategic management, I tell my students, we are all students, because I think rare is any one of us who can claim to be a master at strategic thinking, because of how difficult it is and because of how much effort it takes. So, in that respect, I think we're all students and we're all learning, and we'll all be wrong many times. But as somebody famous once said, it doesn't matter that you're wrong X number of times, you just have to be right more than you're wrong. And the rest will take care of itself.
Absolutely.
So that's just the nature of strategic management. If you expect to be right every time, you wouldn't be able to function as a strategic manager.
Interesting. So here at Vibrant Publishers, we aren't exactly a very big organization, but we are climbing up that ladder. So from the perspective of a small business owner, how does strategic management differ for a small business as compared to, say, a large organization?
Yeah, so there are a few things that a smaller organization needs to think about. First is that are different from large organizations. First is smaller organizations have far fewer resources. And by resources, I don't mean just financial resources, but also in terms of human resources. So in a large organization, and I'll pick, something like, let's say, uh, Walmart or Tesla, some of both are sort of largest organizations in the world. They will have teams and departments devoted to sort of strategic management, right? They might even have a
Correct.
director of strategic planning whose sole job it is to sort of think about big picture issues, strategic issues that might happen in the future, or that happened today, or that happened in the past. In small organizations, you're not going to have that, right? You don't have abundance of human resources that you can sort of bring to bear on strategic management. You have maybe the founder or the founding team, and maybe one or two other people who do it part time. None of who are doing this full time. They're doing this at the same time that they are putting out daily fires here and there, right? So
Correct.
there's that. Second is the sort of liability of smallness, is what we call it in entrepreneurship. Smaller organizations have what's called the liability of smallness, right? Because of the resources. They also have sort of limited resources, both financial, and human resources and technological resources that they can bring to bear on making the future happen, right? A large organization like Tesla or Walmart can say, we think this will be what will be needed 10 years from now. And if we choose, which is a big question, if we choose, we can put these resources to bring, to sort of bring about this future. Now, oftentimes they don't succeed, but that's a separate issue. A smaller organization will be fortunate to even have 10% or 5% of those resources to make the future happen. So a smaller organization always has to sort of make do with less in terms of strategic management, in terms of what's happening in the future. So I think those are some of the challenges that a smaller organization faces that a large organization, because of the advantages of largeness, doesn't have to deal with.
Absolutely. I think you were spot on with that answer. It
Thank
was
you.
very insightful because, yeah, of course, like you said, large companies and organizations, they can actually have a whole department devoted to that particular problem. Like, let's say strategic management. Okay, we have a whole department that's sitting there spending maybe the entire day probably thinking about future trends and
Mhm.
trying to find solutions for that. Whereas smaller organizations, smaller companies, we don't really have that kind of manpower, and it's maybe one or two people trying to balance out different wearing different hats basically
Right,
in the
right,
company.
right.
So when small businesses are creating strategic plans, what do you think are the common components that they tend to overlook or ignore completely?
Well, first is a lot of small organizations are not very good at thinking strategically, uh, partly because the demands of the day to day are so high that there's really no time for them to think about sort of future trends or future events that might sort of affect them. So I think there is that component, right, which is that they're not very good at thinking strategically. Um, Second is, I think sort of small organizations also are not able to um, sort of have mechanisms in place that sort of save them from the biases of the owner or sort of the founding CEO, right? Um, which can affect sort of their ability to maneuver in the marketplace that puts so many demands that they are beyond sort of the management of beyond the attention of any one person. So I would say sort of those are some challenges that small businesses face that they need to that they need to account for.
Understood. Could you speak more about you mentioned the CEOs and the managers. What role do they play in ensuring that all the components are seen while making the strategic plan and
Well,
nothing is ignored?
they play a very important role, right? Because strategic thinking, by definition, relates to the firm as a whole. We also call it big picture thinking. And the CEO or the founder or the owner in a small firm, it's sort of it's their responsibility to think big picture, to think about the various aspects of strategic management, whether they are customer facing or whether they are employee facing or whether they are dealing with the financial side of the business. Um, and I think that's where you sort of want to make sure that the CEO and the top managers have the tools that they need to be able to operate in that manner and to think in that manner.
Correct. You made a good, valid point. I think in small organizations, say the founders or the CEO should have a small team, and I think they should delegate tasks efficiently and spend their time more about thinking spend more time thinking or strategizing and making plans rather than getting themselves involved in rudimentary simple tasks. I think
Well,
that tends to take up a lot of their
that's
time.
another very important thing you bring up, right? So, in a large organization, a top manager can delegate a lot more because they can also hire, or they can sort of hire really, really well paid employees. I mean, Walmart, if I just use Walmart as an example, or even Tesla, right? They can go to the best colleges, they can go to the best sort of people in the labor market and say, we want to bring you on. A small organization doesn't have that luxury, right? So
Correct.
then a lot of times it becomes difficult for them to find the right people to delegate to. At the same time, someone starts a business, not generally not because they want to become a good manager, but they start a business because they sort of are passionate about the idea, right? So, for example, think about this. Maybe I'm good at repairing cars, so I decide to start an auto repair shop, right? Or maybe I'm good at, uh, making stitching clothes, and I start a tailoring shop. Soon after you start, you realize that if you want to grow, you have to become a manager of people because you're going to have to hire people and sort of, you know, but you're not, that was not what led you to start this, right? You didn't start
Correct.
your tailoring shop because you were a good manager of people. Um, so I think oftentimes we sort of forget that the skills that initially got you to start the business are not the skills that you need to be a good strategic manager. Um, and some people never sort of make the transition, right? My favorite example that I use in class is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, right? So as the company grew, Steve Wozniak said, "This is not why I started Apple. If I wanted to manage people, I would have gone to IBM. I would have gone to one of the large players if I want. That's not what I did. That's not what I
Right.
wanted to do." So he sort of stepped back from the strategic management of Apple. He still kept his stock, but he sort of stepped back from the strategic management of Apple and said, "This doesn't excite me anymore," right? But people forget, even Steve Jobs, who sort of came to be known as one of the best strategic thinkers of our time and sort of a paradigm shifting, uh, business tycoon, if you will, as Apple grew, he first struggled with managing a growing company, and the exile that he sort of had to undergo, and sort of the test by fire that he went when that he had to undergo when he was fired from Apple, that sort of helped him become a much better manager than he previously was. So I think, you know we should always sort of keep in mind that strategic management, especially for small firms, can be quite challenging.
Insightful. I really love the Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak example that you gave. That's something I think even our viewers would really cherish.
Thank
And
you.
as you mentioned, Steve Jobs getting fired from Apple, that did give us Pixar Studios. So I think that worked
Yeah.
out.
And
That did
what
work
people
out well.
don't realize is there was a time when Steve Jobs, when he was kicked out, and he had the money, right? It wasn't the money
Absolutely.
that he sort of didn't have. He was in Paris, on traveling around, and he asked himself, he said, do I want to go back into business? Because I really don't need to. I have enough money that I could buy a small villa in France and just live my life here and enjoy life. And he consciously made that choice that, you know, he doesn't think he wants to retire at 26 or 27 or however old he was at that point, sort of mid to late 20s. He said, I thought my best days were not past me, but ahead of me. And I decided to sort of make that, come back into business and try to be a better manager and a better sort of entrepreneur than I was in the past. And I think a lot of small business owners and the small business managers can sort of take inspiration from that.
Interesting. Steve Jobs did talk a lot about mission and even vision. That's something that he would always mention. So, for small businesses, if they were to focus on, say, crafting their mission or their long term vision, how would they go about that?
Well, see, when it comes to mission and vision, right, we talk a lot about that in strategy classes, for example, less so in entrepreneurship, but sort of, sort of in the strategy class. And I think a lot of people think that mission and vision is something to be crafted, which I think leaves out the most important sort of aspects of mission and vision. Um, I think what's we need to keep in mind is that at its heart, a company's vision needs to be inspiring and uplifting. If your employees don't know what your vision is, you haven't done a good job of communicating it, right? And if you have not been able to communicate it, then it's not going to inspire or uplift because nobody can tell you what it is, right? Your mission should describe sort of to the employees what the company does and why it does it, right? Once again, it needs to provide sort of a unifying force in the company. So it has to have a positive role. What I find in a lot of organizations, and I have to say, even in big organizations, is you ask the employees, what is the mission or vision? And they say, let me look it up. Well,
I see your
when you
point.
wake up in the morning, are you reading the mission and the vision to be inspired for the day? Probably not, right? I've seen this in business schools. I work at a business school, and in many, many business schools I've been at, the, even the faculty cannot tell you what the vision of the school is, what the mission of the school is. Forget organize, and we teach this, right? We teach this stuff. So I think it's important to keep in mind that your vision, your mission needs to be understood by your employees, by your customers, by your suppliers, right? By all the important stakeholders, because they have the power to inspire the stakeholders to have to feel like they want this company, this organization to be successful. And as you can imagine, because it is difficult to have a mission or vision like that, a lot of companies just pay lip service to these things. Um, so I think that's where we need to do better.
I love that point that you mentioned, that the mission and vision should be something you continuously repeat, and it's something that all the employees know and they know what they're working towards. It shouldn't be something like you mentioned that say, okay, wait a minute, I need to go back. I'll read the documents and tell you what our mission and vision is.
Yeah.
So it should be something any small business owner wakes up in the morning and that's the first thing he thinks about. Okay, this is my mission. This is what I'm working towards. These are the things I'm going to do. And even these are the things I wouldn't do. So that's really insightful. Could you speak a little bit about strategic management tools and how crucial are they to an organization's success?
See, strategic management, the good thing about the present state of strategic management is it offers a lot of good tools that, if understood and used properly, can be tremendously helpful to managers. I'll start with the simplest one that most people have heard of. Unfortunately, most people use it incorrectly: SWOT analysis.
Yes, that's so common.
It's common, every organization has heard of it. If I'm sure that almost every organization that is worth anything that wants to grow has used some version of SWOT analysis. Most
Absolutely.
people use it incorrectly because what happens with some of these tools is they become so popular We feel like we know them, right? When we don't know them. You know, think about baseball or cricket, baseball in the US or cricket in India, or, whatever version you want to use in different parts of the world of these two games. You're watching a game and you're saying, why didn't the player do this? Why didn't the player do this? Right?
I'm guilty of that. I'm guilty of that.
We all are. And there's a phrase, there's an expression for that in the US: Monday morning quarterbacking, or a backseat driving, right? But what is really happening? What is really happening is we watched these things so much, we think we know what to do in that situation,
Yes,
right?
true.
And the same thing happens with SWOT analysis. We see it mentioned so many times around us, we think we understand it. But I'll tell you this: most people don't even understand that SWOT analysis means strengths and weaknesses are internal to the company, opportunities and threats are external to the company.
Nobody mentions that. Yeah.
Nobody
They
mentions
just
that.
look at it as a whole SWOT
Yeah.
analysis.
Yeah. So you have to understand two things are internal, two things are external. And then those internal things need to stack up with the external things. What strengths allow you to take advantage of what opportunities? What strengths allow you to deal with what threats? What weaknesses make it difficult for you to take advantage of what opportunities? What weaknesses are going to make the threats even worse for your company?
Interesting.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes, I
But
see the
most
connection.
people don't understand this tool, so they use it incorrectly. That's one. So that's sort of one example, right? The other example of sort of strategic management tools you asked about is what we call pestle analysis, right? Um, Political, economic, social, technological, ecological, legal forces in the environment that I need to be mindful of, or I need to keep my eye on, or that I should pay attention to, right? So
Correct.
that I know how to prepare myself for the future that is coming, or to prepare myself for the opportunities and threats that my company has to face. So, pestle analysis is another tool that we talk about in strategic management. Um, I could go on and on, but let me just use one more example: um, ratio analysis, right? Which is, if you want to be a good decision maker for the organization as a whole, which is what strategic management is, you need to understand the ratios, financial ratios of your business. I'll be I I'll share with you that most small business owners are actually very scared of looking at ratios, preferring to leave it to their accountant or whoever the financial sort of person, if the firm is not very small but is large enough to have a CFO or something equivalent, leaving it to them. Well, you cannot do good strategic management if you don't have a basic understanding of ratio analysis. Why? Because you need to commit resources and you need to look at the returns from those resources, right? But if you don't understand the ratio analysis, you can't really use any of that information in your decision making. So I think strategic management offers us very good tools uh, that we need to understand and utilize properly.
Interesting. I think understanding the tools and concepts plays a very crucial role in how you use them. I think if you don't have a complete understanding and you have incomplete knowledge about it, like you mentioned, the SWOT analysis, people don't understand the internal factor, the external factor, and how you connect all of those to work in a synergy to get the best results. So I think making sure that you understand the concepts first is much more important.
Yeah, so people talk about using those concepts, but the first thing is to understand those concepts, right?
Exactly, yes.
And I'll tell you this, when I teach strategic management, I find that with something like SWOT, I first have to work on getting the students unlearn how they think the SWOT should be used, which is not based on any reasonable understanding of the concept. And only if they're willing to unlearn can
Only
we
then will
get
you
to
teach
how
them.
to actually use it properly. So,
Interesting.
a semester for us here is only about 16 weeks, and SWOT analysis is, one part of one chapter in the whole syllabus. But if I had my way, I would spend, 2 or 3 days just talking about SWOT analysis and using it in class. We don't usually get that time, but that's how I would like to sort of deal with this problem, that a lot of times some things need to be unlearned before you can actually learn them.
Love that insight.
Thank you.
Some things need to be unlearned before you can
Mhm.
actually learn them. Something fascinating that I personally felt when I learned all of these concepts, you can actually use it on your own individual life and actually try and find your own strengths and weaknesses
Mhm.
and identify how you can work all of these things in a synergy to have the best results for you. So could you speak a little bit more about how we could use that concepts in our own personal life?
Yeah, so SWOT is a good example, right? I think all of us should be doing SWOT analysis on ourselves periodically in our own lives. What we find is people generally are very good at listing strengths, identifying strengths. I'm not saying they are good at identifying the correct strengths, but they're good at identifying a number of strengths. People are very bad at identifying weaknesses, okay, when they apply
Correct.
SWOT to their own life. The worst most people are is at identifying threats, okay? And I remind my students there is a reason why Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, was motivated to write a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. Even though paranoid is not a good word in most societies today, his point was we all need to be paranoid if we want to identify accurately the threats that confront us.
And
But we are not good at that, not for the organization, especially if we work there, and certainly not in our private lives, in our personal lives. We are not good at identifying threats. Um, so I think what happens is, because weaknesses and threats are sort of, negatively sort of
and
things,
yeah, negative connotation attached to it.
negative connotation, we are not very good at, identifying those. So I think SWOT analysis is a good tool that we can use in our personal lives as well. Second is, think about, what I said about ratio analysis, right? All of us in our personal lives as well need to be somewhat comfortable with financial ratios and ratio analysis. Things like debt to asset ratio. What are my debts and what are my assets? My debts should generally be less than my assets. Well, I am not happy to tell you that most people struggle a lot with that simple thing. That uh, most of the time, what I do should be profitable in terms of the revenue it brings in and in terms of my expenses. Uh, Most people are not very good at sort of dealing with that in their personal lives. So that's another example. Um, so I think strategic management offers us many tools that we can use in our daily lives as well, in our personal lives as well, if we use them correctly.
Interesting. So, moving our focus back to small businesses. Small businesses do not have the luxury of having a lot of financial resources when they were to carry out, say, research about their competitors, etc. So, what are some cost effective ways small businesses can conduct market analysis or competitor research?
Market analysis, competitor research, they are all part of the strategic management toolkit, right? They are not by themselves strategic management, but they're all part of the toolkit. And I think it's very important for small companies, for the top management to give enough time to these issues on a regular basis, right? For example, something as simple as, you know, a weekly, I'm going to set aside 2 hours that are not about firefighting day to day things or firefighting sort of operational demands on your time or operational contingencies, but are sort of committed to identifying or working on strategic issues like who are our competitors? What have they done in the last 1 week or last 1 month that we need to pay attention to? What are the new products or services we can launch to have a leg up on competition going forward? Right? You said about market analysis. Most business people, including large firms, are struggle with market analysis. Who is our target customer? Right? Who should we be targeting? Right? Now that does not mean others may not borrow, others may not buy some of your things. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But you have to appeal to the market segment that you have, right? That you think
Correct.
is the primary market segment for your product. Um, for example, I was reading recently about Ferrari, right? Ferrari made a conscious decision that their products are not going to compete with Toyota or Ford, right? They are going to appeal to a different market segment than those. You cannot be everything to everyone. Sometimes you do see exceptions, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes when you look at those exceptions. People will bring up Apple, for example, in the US as an exception to sort of you can't appeal to everyone. But there's a lot going on behind the scenes that usually people don't know, that explains how once in a while a company can seem to be everything to everyone, but that's usually not the case. So I think small businesses need to give the proper time and attention to these things. I think small businesses think that it's a financial issue, but often it's an issue of time and attention.
Correct. I love the example of Ferrari that you mentioned. It actually does give you a better perspective and helps you understand the point you're getting at. So let's talk a little bit more about culture and the influence it has on a small business's strategy. How does culture affect, make, or break a small business strategy?
See, when I teach strategic management, I tell my students that organizational culture is part of strategy, because as a strategic manager, as a CEO, you are responsible for the culture in your organization, right? You make it happen in terms of what kind of an organization you want, right? And so I think good culture is very important. Again, a lot of firms and a lot of leaders of those firms don't pay enough attention to the culture in the organization. Without the right culture in the organization, you're going to find that your ability to compete effectively in the market over the long run gets limited. Um, and I think often, even in strategy, when we teach strategic management, we don't give enough attention to culture because it feels so sort of fuzzy, right? uh, if I want to talk to my students about ratio analysis, I know what I need to talk to them about, right? Revenues, assets, liabilities, expenses. I can teach them. There are formulas I can show them. I can make them work on those formulas. All culture is sort of much more amorphous, much more fuzzy. So I think it needs much more attention in organizations that want to grow. And the tone is set at the top. Culture is not something, it's like raising kids, right? they
Correct.
they they will do what they see. You can tell them whatever you want. They are watching, right? And so the same in
Absolutely.
organizations. If the bosses are behaving inappropriately, unethically, it's hard for them to communicate, or it's hard for them to have a culture of appropriateness and ethics in the company.
Absolutely. I love what you said. It starts at the top.
The tone
That's
is set
where
at the top, just
that's
like
where
in
it
the
starts,
family.
the culture.
The tone is set at the top.
And employees, it's like raising kids. So they are to imitate exactly what they see.
Yeah.
And
The good thing with employees is you get to choose who you bring in, right?
correct.
And you get to choose who you sort of let go, which is not a luxury you have in the family, right? Where sort of once you bring someone in, you you really don't have many options. But in an organization, you can choose. In most organizations, I would say. So the tone sets at the top. And even in organizations where you don't have much authority in hiring or firing employees, say in a public organization, right? The same concept applies. The tone is set at the top. The culture is the top manager's responsibility, right? And
Correct.
creates that creates the proper conditions in the firm or the organization to succeed or not to succeed.
Absolutely. I think that was spot on. I have had a couple of conversations with my friends about their work culture and how do they feel at work. And I think one of the key insights I've got over time is that people don't quit the job because of the workload or because of the pressure they feel out there of having too many tasks to do. I think it's always the culture that makes or breaks their decision of whether they want to stay there or they want to move on. I think companies have to ensure that it's not a toxic culture. And rather, when you come to work, you should feel like you're a part of the family, like you belong there, like people actually want you to be a part of that team. So I think culture is something that's overlooked. And as you mentioned, it's a fuzzy topic, doesn't have a set structure that you could look at and say, okay, these are the pointers, this is what we got to do.
And I think it goes both ways, right? Which is, yes, the tone is set at the bottom, at the top. I'm sorry, the
At the
tone is
top,
set at
yes.
the top. And yes, the culture is the top manager's responsibility. Yet, if you join a firm, you also want to sort of behave in a way that you send the right signals as to who you are as a person, right? So, we don't sort of talk about this in strategic management, to be honest. But for example, I tell my students that, always think about, be the change you want to see, right?
Correct.
For
Correct.
example, if you have an abusive supervisor, you know, tomorrow when you become a supervisor, don't think, this is how I was treated and this is how I'm going to treat, right? You say, I'm going to be the change I want to see, which is I'm not going to abuse my employees. Uh, that's one. Second, you see organizations like the world, there are all different types of people, right? So
Absolutely, yes.
if let's say you're working for someone who's abusive and that bothers you, seek out the mentorship of people who you think are not that, who you can look up to, and then try to sort of emulate them, make them your role model uh, as you go through. through sort of your career. So I think that's
Interesting.
also important for sort of newcomers in business or organizations to understand.
Interesting. So, the understanding that I get, and I feel strategic management is something that you learn over time, and it's something you gain insight into when you have hands on experience. So, how effective do you think university courses are when they teach you strategic management? Are they worth the investment?
See, I think there's no right or wrong answer here, or there's no easy answer. Are university courses helpful? Yes. I think where people sort of make a mistake is to think that just because they scored well on a test, or because they can tell you the theory of something, that they can also claim to be good at it in practice. What I talk when I discuss this in my class, I ask students, so let's say you're going for heart surgery, or maybe you're not going. It's difficult for 20-year-olds or 19-year-old students to sometimes imagine sort of that. I say, imagine that your grandfather or your grandmother or your father or your mother is going for heart surgery, right? Would you choose a doctor who's never done heart surgery but has read a book about it and is an expert on answering questions about heart surgery? I have never had a student say yes to that. Then I say, would you choose a doctor who didn't go to medical school but practiced cutting the heart in his basement and can show you videos of him cutting the heart? And he claims he does a very good job of cutting the heart and fixing things. I've never had a student who said, yes, I would take my dad or my mom to a heart surgeon like that. So, if when it comes to medicine, we don't accept sort of these polar opposites, only theory, only practice, why do we accept that when it comes to business? Is business any less important than heart surgery? Some people think, well, we are not really dealing with life and death. But I think that's sort of making things seem more simple than they are. Like in medicine, what you want is both. You want to have good conceptual understanding and you want to have good practical experience, right? At the same time, what we often don't realize is good doctors, especially at that level, heart surgery, are also people who keep updating their knowledge as time passes by, right? Because new technologies are coming. Heart surgery today is not what heart surgery used to be 30 years ago. Technology is much different. The facilities in the operation theater are much different. The kind of tools you can use today are much different. Would you go for or take your mom and your dad for heart surgery to someone who did it 30 years ago very well but hasn't done it ever since? No.
Absolutely not. No.
So that's the same thing you want in business, right? Where people are updating their tools, updating their knowledge. Part of that is being in the field, but part of that is also being willing to take a step back and going back to the classroom and saying, when I first was exposed to this concept of mission and vision, perhaps I was only 20 years old and I didn't quite sort of understand or appreciate the complexities. But 20 years later, I'm not the same me as I was 20 years ago,
Correct.
right? So
You have a much better understanding.
my ability to understand mission and vision today is much different from what it was when I was 19-year old. So I think classrooms or college courses are important. I think we need to find a good balance in theory and practice. It should not be either or, it should be both.
Absolutely. I love the example that you gave of the heart surgeon taking your parents to the doctor. And I hope you never get a student that ever says yes to that
I've never
question.
had. And I've asked this question in many countries. I've asked this question in
Absolutely.
many universities in the US. I've asked this question in many universities in India, where I come from. I've never had a student say, yes, I would sort of go for either of the polar opposites.
Correct. So the answer to that would be having a balance of both worlds,
Balance.
having theoretical knowledge as well as hands on experience.
This balance is very important, of
That's the key.
theory and practice. Just like it is very important in driving,
Correct.
right? The theory tells you how things should be, right? The practice tells you how things are, right? And you bring those both together, you take us to the next step in terms
Correct.
of doing them well. And then it's important to keep updating your knowledge. Bill Gates, I don't know if he still does it. Bill Gates used to take a week off in the year to do nothing but read books that people would recommend him, books about latest technology, books about latest something wonderful in business, books about international relations, whatever people recommended. He would take a week and just do that. Why? Because day to day, he said he wasn't getting the time to update his understanding of the way the world works, or the way the business works, or the way the industry works. And if you I tell my students, when the internet first came out, Bill Gates' initial reaction was to say it's just a fad, right? And he wrote about that. But as he saw the power of the internet, as he read more about what you could do with the internet, he changed his views, right? A lot of people find it difficult to change their views,
Correct.
right? We have this commitment bias. I've already staked out this position, now I'm going to stick to this. No, you update your knowledge, and as you update your knowledge, your views might change on issues that your business faces, or issues that are going on around you. You update your knowledge accordingly. And of course, then Bill Gates became a champion of the internet, and sort of, figured, worked hard on how to take Microsoft to the next level in the internet age.
Interesting. For the next question, I have to convince I'm a bit of a movie buff. And if you take, for example, movies such as The Godfather, Social Network, or Wall Street, they do hit certain strategic management theories and concepts in those movies, although they might be a bit vague. Could you speak a little about how can business leaders learn about strategic management from these movies?
It's a very interesting question you bring up. If you look at my small business entrepreneurship textbook, you will find that every chapter, one of the things at the end is in the movies. Okay. And what I'm trying to say is, I just talked to you about this concept or this topic in class. Go watch this movie. And they do a good job of not, see, a movie's job is to entertain, right?
Correct.
So do they take liberties? Yes. Do they make things sort of, funny or whatever, and sort of sometimes deviate from what is the truth? Yes. But what you're going to do there is to sort of say, interesting. Okay.
I see your
Not
point.
that
Yes.
this is the final word on this topic. Anyone who thinks any movie is the final word on any topic, I think they should watch more movies, because they don't understand what the purpose of the movie is. Okay. So recently, I watched a very interesting movie on Amazon Prime. Okay. Saving Paradise. Okay. It's a Hollywood movie filled with all the cliches that happen in Hollywood movies, or any movies, right? Boy meets girl, romance, all that. But the movie is about 100-year-old family business. Okay. It talks about some of the same things that I talk about when I teach family business in my class. the legacy. When you're making decisions, you not just have to think about the decisions today, but you have to think, and people make you think about the decisions your grandparents took when they were managing the business, or your great grandparents took when they were managing the business, or your parents took when they were managing the business, right? Then it talks about sort of how in family business, family and business sometimes collide. It talks
Correct.
about how in family business, sometimes the younger generation has to make decisions that are good for the family business, even though it may not be what they think is their dream, right? So I think movies can play a very, very important role. Of course, it doesn't mean you take it to be, the literal gospel truth, but you take it as, oh, it got me thinking about that concept. That's one. Also, you talked about movies like Godfather, right?
Yes.
Movies can often also sort of blur the line between ethics, what is ethical and unethical, right?
Correct.
And I think when we watch movies, we should be mindful of that this was made for entertainment purpose. And where do I want to draw the boundaries between ethical and unethical may not be where Don Corleone drew the boundaries between ethical and unethical. So I think
Absolutely.
we need to be mindful of those things as well when we look towards movies. But I think movies are an underappreciated tool in business teaching in general, and certainly in strategic management.
Interesting. It's fascinating how storytelling can actually teach you a little bit about real world business.
Yes, because at the heart of the day, to make that movie interesting, they also need to look at what's going on around us,
Correct.
right? So that's why I think movies can. Office Space is another, common movie. I don't talk about it. I talk about it when I talk about culture. Earlier you talked about culture. If you haven't
Correct.
seen the movie Office Space, and increasingly my students have not seen the movie, there used to be the time when I would ask Office Space, and the majority of the class would raise their hand. But today, I would be lucky if I get two people in class who raise their hand when I ask them about Office Space. But it shows you how in so many organizations, so many people are sort of disconnected from the organization. Their only interest is clocking in, clocking out, collect a paycheck. So I think in that sense, the movie is wonderful. Now, of course, the unethical things that they show in the movie, those I would never sort of support in my classroom
Correct.
or for my students.
That's a good point you make. The conversation so far has been very insightful, and I would like to wrap it up with one final question. So, what would be one final piece of advice you would give small business owners looking to level up their strategy?
One advice I would give to small business owners is to find some time every week to think about the strategic issues facing their company or their business, away from the day to day of the business, to focus on the big picture of the business. Whether the big picture is about what is the purpose of this business, what are the long term goals that I want to accomplish, whether the purpose is what sort of employees do I want to train, right?
Correct.
Whether the purpose is how do I want others to see my company, right? Whatever those big picture issues are, I think one needs to set aside time that is dedicated to that. And by dedicated, I mean away from distractions. Not where you're also answering five messages on the phone, looking up on your screen, also
Right.
taking employee phone calls. Not like that. Where this is the focus, strategic thinking. That's what I'm going to do for a certain amount, whatever that amount of time is. And that might depend also on what stage the business is going through, right? So if the time is particularly turbulent in your industry, then once a week may not be enough, right? If it's sort of business as usual in the industry, okay, then maybe once a week is enough. Maybe the business is going through internal crisis, then you might need to do this again more regularly versus a business where again things are going normal. So I think setting aside time. The second thing, I sort of, you asked me one thing, so that's what I would advise, but related to that is also understand your own limitations. That doesn't mean you cannot improve on those limitations. You can, every one of us can, and we should, but understand your own limitations in terms of what is it in terms of strategic thinking that you actually have the skills to do, and what you either need to learn or bring someone from the outside, right? I ask people, if you have a heart problem, will you go to a dermatologist? They say, no, of course not. I would go to a cardiologist. But in business, we don't think of these specializations. We think I am a fix all person because I either started this business or inherited this business or got appointed as CEO of this business. Now I know it all. I think we should sort of be more humble about our limitations, acknowledge that there may be things that I don't understand or don't know. And if that is the case, I need to bring in someone who can help me with those things. And for many small business owners, that might be a friend, that might be a former colleague from a different time in their career. I think those are sort of two interrelated pieces of advice I would give.
Brilliant. That was a very insightful answer. And I think that's a good note to wrap the podcast on. So I just want to say thank you, Vishal. It's been an
Thank you,
absolute
Johannes, for
delight.
having.
It's been an absolute delight hosting you. And I hope sometime in the future, maybe we could get back on a podcast over a completely different topic and gain some insight.
If it's something I know, I'll be very happy to be back here. I enjoyed
Absolutely.
my time with you today thoroughly. And again, thanks for having me.